Hello everyone. Tonight we drift back into the cobbled streets of medieval London, where the morning air still carries the damp scent of stone and the distant cries of street vendors echo through the alleys. Imagine this: a restless crowd, shoulder to shoulder, their breath forming white mist in the frigid dawn, all waiting for a scene so brutal that even in their harsh times, it bordered on the unthinkable. In the year 1305, a single man, William Wallace, approached the final moments of his life. Bound and battered, yet standing with more defiance than the armored legions sent to crush him. The torches flickered against the wooden scaffold, casting long, quivering shadows across the eager faces of the crowd. And if you think you're brave enough to endure what's about to unfold, you probably wouldn't have survived 5 minutes back then. So before you truly settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel only if you genuinely enjoy what we do here. By the way, drop a comment to let me know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. There's something comforting about knowing we're all awake together in the middle of the night. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a little fan for that soft hum of wind, and let's slowly step into tonight's journey.
Will you fight? Against that? No!
Imagine that right now. You are standing in a dense crowd, hoods shivering under the morning chill. The dim light of dawn slips through gray stone buildings, illuminating the face of William Wallace, the man everyone whispers about as Scotland's most terrifying rebel. You can hear the clatter of hooves, the scent of dry straw mixed with human breath, and a chill running down your spine. As if everyone is waiting for a moment no one truly wants to witness. Yet none are brave enough to look away. Wallace is bound tightly to a rough wooden plank, his thin hands trembling perhaps from the cold, or perhaps from the shame of being turned into a public spectacle. They say this isn't just an execution. It's the royal crown's most vivid speech, as if King Edward wanted to carve this story into the memory of every subject. A curious detail, rarely mentioned, is that before being brought out, Wallace was given a strong herbal liquor. Some say it was meant to ease the fear, but many believe it was to keep him conscious until the very end after all. What's a grand performance without its main character? You can almost feel your own legs going numb like Wallace's, as he's dragged along cobbled streets, the chains scraping against stone in a slow Thomas. Steady rhythm, like a ticking clock. No one dares to stop. On a street corner, children stare at him with eyes full of fear and curiosity. Funny, isn't it? Adults pretend to be calm, while the children are the only ones honest enough not to hide their unease at witnessing the humiliation of a man. According to official records, this execution was not just punishment. It was meant to reinforce the invincibility of Edward's image. After Wallace's triumphant rebellion at Stirling Bridge, he had become a symbol of Scottish pride, something the English king despised. And so, he chose the most brutal form of execution of that era, to hang him until nearly dead. Bring him down only to watch his body be dismantled piece by piece. Sounds horrifying, I know, but don't worry. You're only listening to a story here, not participating. Still, if you're sipping a cup of tea tonight, you might want to set it aside. This content is a little hard to digest. Historians still debate what Wallace truly felt as he was led across London Bridge. Some theories claim he held his head high, quietly gazing at the river as though he had accepted his fate. But other records suggest he whispered something to the soldier escorting him, a phrase no one has definitively deciphered. Some believe it was a curse, others think it was a prayer, and a few, with a sense of humor, I believe it was a sarcastic comment about the way the English tied their ropes. Whatever the case, that moment remains a strange knot in the story. A man turned into a symbol, and in the end, That symbol is what led him to death. A lesser-known detail. Before being captured, Wallace once hid in a small monastery near Glasgow. It is said that every night he would sneak out to the back garden and sit for hours staring up at the sky. You might think he was dreaming of freedom or victory, but who knows, maybe he was simply wondering, will I survive this winter? You see, sometimes a person isn't a hero in every moment. They're just someone who survived longer than expected. Do you hear the wind passing through the cracks in your door? That steady sound is not so different from the atmosphere at the execution, a tense silence that no one dared to break. When Wallace was placed on the gallows, the crowd pushed in so tightly that some people fainted. But even then, sweet bun vendors continued to call out cheerfully. It sounds absurd, but history often mixes tragedy and comedy so blatantly that no one knows whether to laugh or cry. You might wonder, what exactly did William Wallace do to deserve such a horrifying fate? Was it just because he defeated a few of the king's armies? Or was there a deeper reason, hidden beneath the dented armor of war? People often summarize that Wallace was executed for treason, but in truth, the word treason was merely a shell covering a much more complicated grudge. In the final years of the 13th century, Edward's England didn't just want to rule Scotland. He wanted the Scots to believe they never had the right to rule themselves. In the king's eyes, Wallace wasn't just a rebel, was the living embodiment of the most dangerous idea of all, that a small nation could still raise its head and stand against a vast empire. The first major event that led to Wallace's death sentence was the victory at Stirling Bridge in 1297. Wallace and his allies orchestrated a daring ambush that trapped the English forces on a narrow bridge and wiped out almost the entire army. Historians still debate whether Wallace was the direct commander. Some records suggest he only played a strategic support role. But regardless of who gave the final order, that victory humiliated Edward deeply. Interestingly, after the battle, Wallace was named Guardian of Scotland, a title he likely never imagined would one day become his death sentence. Just a few years earlier, he was merely the son of a minor landowner, whose farm had been raided and plundered by English soldiers. Then suddenly, he became the figurehead of a full-blown resistance. In the dark of night, he must have asked himself, "What am I doing? I just wanted to tend my sheep in peace." But rage is never easily extinguished. It catches fire. It devours every compromise in its path. One thing rarely mentioned is that Edward I was not just an ambitious king. He was a man whose pride had been deeply wounded. In the years before, Edward had crushed the Welsh uprising with an iron hand, building fortresses everywhere and forcing the people into submission. In his mind, Scotland was no different, just another wild land waiting to be tamed. That's why Wallace's very existence was a thorn in that pride, a stinging reminder that not everyone bows. After Stirling, Wallace continued raiding across the border. Some records claim he once burned a granary in an English town, causing public panic. And taking away someone's dinner has never been a wise way to avoid making enemies. Historians still debate the scale of the destruction. Some sources mention only a few storehouses. Others exaggerate it to an entire region flattened. Whatever the truth, those attacks solidified Wallace's image in English eyes. A wild beast, both dangerous and defiant. On top of that, Wallace had no noble blood. In a society obsessed with class, this was yet another reason he was scorned. For Edward and his court, being humiliated by someone of low birth was more disgraceful than losing to a famous lord. Some have joked that if Wallace had been a duke, he might have been granted a quick beheading. But because he was a stubborn commoner, he was subjected to the most dreadful punishment, a blunt message that those on the margins should never dream of making history. You can imagine Edward's eyes as he signed the execution order, cold indifferent, like a man brushing dust off his cloak. In the palace, it wasn't a significant decision. It was just another administrative procedure, stamped and filed away. But out on the streets, that same decree became a storm, tearing through the Scottish spirit. And perhaps that is precisely what turned Wallace into a legend. A strange detail few know. Wallace's indictment was so long that it had to be copied onto multiple parchment rolls. Each charge was listed in Latin, filled with flowery language, as if trying to turn him into the embodiment of every sin. Among them was the charge of offending the church, for attacking troops guarding an English monastery. Of course, Scottish monks insisted he was simply reclaiming stolen grain. Who told the truth? We'll probably never know for sure. Some scholars today believe that Edward didn't just want to kill Wallace, he wanted to kill Scotland's hope. The prolonged punishment, carried out with great spectacle, was his way of sowing fear so no one else would dare follow. But ironically, the very pageantry of the punishment made the story impossible to bury. Think about if he had been quietly executed in a dark cell. Would we be sitting here in the middle of the night, listening to his tale? That's history for you often. A play written in reverse. The rulers believe that the more brutally they suppress, the more secure their power becomes. But in the end, it's that very cruelty that plants the seeds of immortal memory. If you've ever been told you're not worthy of doing something great, Wallace's story might make you smile. A nameless farmer left a mark no empire could erase. Edward was born in 1239, the eldest son of King Henry III. From a young age, he was known for his unusually tall stature. People nicknamed him Longshanks because he towered over most knights of his time, estimated at around 6'2", an almost giant height in the 13th century. Some joked that if he hadn't become king, he might have made a fine ceremonial ribbon cutter at festivals thanks to those long legs. Even as a young man, Edward showed ambition and a fierce temperament. At just over 20 years old, he took part in the Barons' War, a prolonged conflict between the king and discontented English nobles. At the time, his father was seen as weak and easily manipulated, while Edward was the opposite, so firm that many feared him. Historians still debate whether he was truly loyal to his father or merely seizing an opportunity to build his own power. Whatever the motive, that war forged two lifelong habits: never tolerating disobedience, and always believing that strength was the answer to every political problem. A lesser-remembered detail: Edward nearly died during the Ninth Crusade. In 1270, he led an expedition to the Middle East, determined to defend the Christian faith. During an assassination attempt in Acre, an unknown attacker stabbed him with a poisoned dagger. Though the wound was deep and plagued him for months, Edward survived and became even more convinced that God had chosen him for a great mission. You can picture him lying feverish in bed, waking up and thinking, clearly I've been blessed to conquer the rest of the stubborn ones. How humble indeed. After returning to England, Edward officially ascended the throne in 1272, and from that point on, you could view his entire reign as a continuous campaign to expand power. He quickly crushed resistance in Wales to ensure the region never rose up again. He built a series of massive stone castles-fortresses that still stand defiant against time today. It was one of the greatest military construction projects of the Middle Ages. Legend has it that the Welsh despised Edward so much that when news of his death reached them, they threw celebratory feasts, a strange little detail often overlooked. Edward was the first to enact a law banning football in England, believing it distracted soldiers from archery practice. You see, beyond conquest, he was also a lifelong enemy of street football matches. If you're ever annoyed by noisy neighbors kicking a ball outside your door, perhaps you and Edward would have found common ground. However, among all his campaigns, Edward was particularly obsessed with Scotland. He saw it as the final piece to complete a unified Britain under Plantagenet rule. At first, he took advantage of a succession crisis when the Scottish king died without an heir. Edward declared himself arbiter of justice, then quickly transformed that role into actual control. While many Scottish nobles submitted, Wallace rose as the one man who refused to bow. Perhaps it was that very defiance that made Edward both enraged and haunted. Scholars still debate Edward's psyche. Was he a stern leader who believed he was bringing civilized order to a wild land, or merely a power-obsessed tyrant? The answer likely lies somewhere between the extremes. In every record, he appears as both a shrewd politician and a man who believed he was chosen by God, so any resistance was seen as blasphemy. If you're still listening, you'd probably agree on one thing. Edward is a perfect example of how someone can be both great and notorious. Great for his organization and decisiveness, notorious for his unflinching cruelty. Another chillingly strange anecdote. As he was nearing death in 1307, Edward ordered that his corpse be carried into the final campaign against Scotlandus, a way to inspire victory in his troops. In the end, this wish wasn't fully carried out, but the mere idea is enough to make one shudder. Who volunteers to become a posthumous war trophy? You can breathe a little easier knowing that today we no longer have kings who believe they are instruments of divine will. Still, Edward's legacy remains etched across the British Isles, the Welsh castles, the ancient stone bridges, and the memory of a time when power was measured by the number of fortresses and executions. If you're wondering, perhaps the scariest thing wasn't his harsh decisions, but how normal they were to him. In royal records, Wallace's sentence was just a single line among countless decrees: administer proper punishment to preserve royal authority. A cold phrase, yet it shaped an enormous tragedy. Are you still with me? If your eyelids are getting heavy, I promise I'll share just a little more about how this king steered not just the Kingdom of England, but perhaps the very fear in the hearts of everyone beneath him. When Edward I took the crown, England was in a state of unrest. The legal system was a tangled mess. Local lords each ruled their own corners, and the royal treasury was drowning in debt from wasteful wars. You might imagine the court as one giant family where everyone hoards their own money and no one wants to pitch in. Edward chose to restore order by doing what he did best: issuing new laws and forcing everyone to obey. A major milestone was the Statutes of Westminster, first issued in 1275. Considered the foundation for English legal reform. They covered everything from land ownership and inheritance to minor details like who could collect taxes at local fairs. It may sound dry, but those documents helped shape English law for centuries. One interesting point often overlooked: Edward was obsessed with land arbitration. He believed that by controlling who owned land, he could also control their loyalty. So during his reign, numerous investigations were launched to audit land titles. If you were a farmer then, you were probably exhausted from inspection teams ransacking your barn, questioning every acre, and demanding sworn declarations. Some joked that in those days, people feared tax assessors more than winter storms. In addition to legal reforms, Edward was ruthless in taxation. He taxed anything he could: salt, wool, wine, and even noble assets. Historians still debate whether these revenues were purely to fund conquest or genuinely strengthen the royal treasury. Whatever the truth, the poor probably didn't care. Their pockets kept getting thinner. You can imagine a morning at the market. You buy a chunk of cheese and hear the taxman call out, "Transport tax, protection tax, fragrance tax, not so different from today's utility bills except back then. You couldn't call customer service to complain. One of the most controversial decisions during Edward's reign was the expulsion of all Jews from England in 1290. This was the first large-scale expulsion of a Jewish community in medieval Europe. The official reason was usury high-interest lending. But the deeper motives were complex. Many nobles were deeply indebted to Jewish lenders. An expulsion was the quickest way to erase uncollectible debts. A neat solution, but one that reveals Edward's harsh and calculated style of rule. Some say Edward was a brilliant administrator who ushered England into a more structured legal age. Others claim he was a ruthless pragmatist, willing to sacrifice anyone to achieve his goals. Perhaps both are true. In every decision, he wasn't afraid to turn justice into a political weapon, nor to use fear as the mortar to build an empire. And if you need a strange little detail to stretch your mind, here it is. Edward was an avid hunter. Legend says he spent months roaming through dense forests, accompanied by a large retinue just to chase a few deer. Sounds noble, perhaps, but in truth, those excursions were also a clever way to test the loyalty of local lords. If the landowners didn't host him properly, they would soon be summoned to explain themselves before the royal court. You see, even Edward's pastimes came with a hint of veiled threat. As you lie and listen to the story, you might wonder, how much did people fear him? One chronicler once wrote that just the news of Edward's approach was enough to send entire regions scrambling to repair roads, clean up trash, and prepare gifts whether or not he actually stopped by. His presence was like a storm. No one dared to guess what it would sweep away. And even after decades of ruling with iron and steel, Edward never let go of his ultimate goal: to subdue Scotland completely. In his final years, when age had already caught up with him, he was still thinking of new campaigns. Some accounts say that on his deathbed, he murmured again and again the names of Scottish lands yet to be conquered. That ambition, like an unyielding flame, eventually burned through what little strength he had left. You might feel both curious and chilled hearing about a man who believed his mission was greater than all human empathy. And yet, history doesn't always concern itself with good or evil. It simply remembers those who were ruthless enough to carve their names into the old pages. If you're sighing right now, trust me, I am too. Because in stories like this, it's hard to find anyone entirely lovable. And so, you've just heard how Edward Longshanks built his Imperia mixture of iron discipline, pride, and at times, unapologetic cruelty. By 1307, Edward was over 60 years, old, a remarkable age by medieval standards. Still, he insisted on leading his army northward, toward Scotland. In his mind, this was the final campaign to end all resistance. You might smirk imagining a tall, aging man with silver-streaked hair, still donning heavy armor, stubbornly demanding to command in person. If anyone dared suggest he rest by the hearth, Edward would likely frown as if it were the gravest insult. They say that on the march, his strength dwindled. The legs that once stormed battlefields now trembled, every step needing support. But still, he refused to leave the front. One night in July, the army stopped near the shores of Solway Firth. Too weak to sit up, Edward simply lay there, staring at the water shimmering with moonlight. You can imagine that in the salty stillness of the sea breeze, the old man who once terrified all of Wales was now facing the one thing no one could conquer: death. A strange and rarely remembered detail. Edward ordered that upon his death, his body be boiled in a large cauldrona ritual known as Mos Tutonakuso, that his bones could be buried separately. He even wanted his bones to be carried with the army, as a lasting symbol of authority. Some of his attendants reportedly swallowed nervously at this request. You can picture them thinking, "We may love the man, but we don't necessarily want to haul around his skeleton." In the end, this wish was never fully carried out. On the 7th of July, 1807, Edward breathed his last. In that moment, the entire camp fell silent. Some wept, some felt relief. Perhaps they understood that with his death, an entire era was closing. His body was taken south and buried at Westminster Abbey, the resting place of English kings. His tomb bore a Latin inscription, which roughly translates to, "Here lies Edward, the greatest of kings who united all England," a rather self-congratulatory line. But if you look back on his life, you must admit, Edward truly left a deep mark. Whether that mark came from power, law, or fear, it remains a legacy no one can deny. You might exhale when you realize that no matter how vast the power, every king ends the same way, as dust. And then the bigger question begins. After Edward was gone, what happened next? The short answer is, a lot of chaos. His son, Edward II, took the throne. But if you're expecting a ruler with the same iron resolve, sorry to disappoint. Edward II was more like a pale, clumsy reflection of his father. Historians still debate whether he lacked ambition or was simply too gentle to rule a kingdom, molded into a machine of iron discipline, while Edward II was still fumbling to assert his power. Scotland quickly seized the moment. Robert the Bruce, name you've likely heard, merged as the new leader of the resistance. And if you remember, it was the brutal death of William Wallace that helped ignite the fire for Robert. In a way, Edward I, even after death, indirectly created his next great enemy. One rarely mentioned fact: Edward II was not only weak-willed but also enamored with recreational rowing. While the court debated war, he was leisurely paddling up and down the Thames. Charming, perhaps, but not exactly the image of a man inheriting Longshanks's legacy. If Edward I had been alive to witness that, he'd probably shake his head, hand clenched tight around his sword hilt in disappointment. As you lie and listen, you might feel a tinge of bitterness. So many lives lost. So many lands seized only to leave behind a throne shaken, its glory dimmed by the heir who couldn't sustain it. Perhaps that's the eternal rule of power. It's strongest when someone fiercely upholds it, and it dissolves swiftly when no one dares to carry its weight. As for Scotland, England's power vacuum was the perfect gift. Robert the Bruce achieved a resounding victory at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, just 7 years after Edward R's death. That battle nearly reversed the entirety of Longshanks' lifelong efforts. Imagine him lying in his grave if he could hear the news. He certainly wouldn't be pleased. And yet, strangely, despite failure, the image of Edward I was preserved in England's memory as a symbol of iron will. The castles he built in Wales still stand tall. The legal system continued to evolve, and his hunger for conquest became legend. Some hailed him as Edward the Great of England. Others simply called him the sower of hatred. And it's hard to say who was more right. If you're looking for a lesson in this story, perhaps it's this: no matter how powerful a man may be, he is still only mortal. A mortal who believed he could shape history at will but could never reshape the hearts of those he wished to conquer. Are you still awake? Because now, we return to the image of William Wallace, the man whose name, even after his body was torn apart, lived on like a smoldering flame, burning for centuries. Ask yourself this: how could a man with almost no power, no throne, no noble bloodline shake an entire dynasty like Edward's, an empire that seemed unshakable, perhaps because he touched the one thing every tyrant fears most, the immortality of an idea. One can crush an army, destroy a fortress, plunder an entire land, but no one can hang a yearning. Wallace wasn't a flawless saint, was a man of rage, of mistakes, and of ambition. Yet it was this imperfection that made him more relatable to anyone who has ever been cornered and forced to choose. Bow down, or stand to leave, if the price is life itself. Close your eyes, if you will, and picture that cold morning as he was dragged through the damp streets, his face pale from hunger, hands tied behind his back, his body bloodied, but his eyes, those eyes, still stared straight ahead, as if to remind the crowd, I am still myself. You can only kill this flesh. If you're lying there listening, you might come to a quiet realization. Tyrannical power always believes itself grand. But in truth, it is laughably fragile. It needs an audience. It needs cheers. It needs collective fear to survive. True freedom, on the other hand, asks for no recognition. It only needs one soul brave enough to hold it until their very last breath. Someone once wrote that Wallace's death was not just an execution, it was a test of a nation's soul, a cruel challenge to see how many would stay silent, and how many would still raise their voices. And as you've seen, the final outcome was not oblivion. Just a few years later, those who once bowed stood tall again, and in their eyes, William Wallace was no longer a rebel but the quiet banner of human dignity. Tonight, as you listen to this tale, remember that history is not only written by the victors, it is also written in the blood of those who refuse to sell their conscience for safety, those who, even when stripped of everything, held on to one final thing, the right to not bow. Are you still listening? If the night outside your window has grown thick and dark, take a slow breath, because this next part is not easy to hear. When William Wallace finally fell silent, this last breath dissolving into the wind and the murmuring pleasure of the crowd, no one could have imagined his battered body would still be used one more time. But in truth, even in death, he was not spared. By order of King Edward, Wallace's corpse was to be meticulously processed into a tool of terror. First, his body was cut into 4 parts of cold, brutal ritual, known as quartering. You might be lying there now, eyes half closed, wondering why such a display. The answer is bitter, because once a man dares to awaken the yearning for freedom, even his corpse must be made into a warning. Wallace's head was preserved with tar to prevent rapid decay. Then it was placed atop a long pike and erected on London Bridge, the largest, busiest, most watchful city in England at the time. Every passerby would see that face, or at least the shriveled remnants of it, as a reminder. This is the fate of rebels. The 4 quarters of his body were not left in peace either. They were distributed and displayed across major Scottish towns: Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth. In each place, a fragment of his remains was hung publicly on city gates, in the square, or at the market entrance wherever the crowds were thickest. You can imagine the local people passing by, heads bowed, filled with horror and anger but unable to speak it aloud. Historians still debate whether the scattering of Wallace's remains truly had its intended effect. Some argue it dampened the resistance movement for a short time, but other records suggest that turning him into a crucified symbol across the 4 corners only deepened the Scottish vow never to yield. There's a lesser-known detail. Before Wallace's head was mounted on London Bridge, it was kept overnight in the tower to ensure it would be properly presented. That scene must have been chilling a silent face waiting for dawn, as if to say that even though the body had been torn apart, the will still stared straight at the enemy. It was often believed that the public would tremble in fear, that the sight of Wallace's severed head and limbs would break a nation's spirit. And indeed, many were subdued. In the towns, Scottish farmers bit their lips as they passed the remains hung on city gates. Many lowered their heads, pretending not to see, afraid of the English guards' watching eyes. But something simmered behind their gauzy, a mixture of fear, shame, and an unspoken bitterness. Imagine yourself carrying a bundle of firewood, a child clinging to your leg, and suddenly the child asks, "Father, what is that?" Perhaps in that moment, the only answer is a heavy nod and a soft whisper, "Remember his name." In the more remote villages, where news didn't travel quickly, reactions were mixed. Some sighed with relief, as Wallace had once brought hardship through war. Others held a quiet reverence, understanding he had been the only one bold enough to say no to Edward. There were also those who despised him, blaming him for bringing ruin upon them all. History is never a uniform emotion. It is a patchwork quilt sewn from fear, admiration, anger, and sorrow. Yet if you look closely, you'll find something more enduring than surface reactions, the awareness that someone dared to do what most would not. Perhaps that is what kept Wallace's image from fading. In London, not all the English were smug. Many who passed the bridge and saw the head on its pike felt a creeping unease. It was not just the corpse of an enemy, but proof that the crown would do anything to retain power. Some accounts say whispers floated through taverns at night. Today it's him but one day. It could be any one of us. Another rarely mentioned detail. In Perth, when a quarter of Wallace's body was hung on the city gate, someone secretly placed a sprig of grass on the stone ledge below. No one knows who it was, an old mother, a defeated warrior, or just a sorrowful townsfolk. But that small act felt like a silent rebellion, a reminder that a person is not erased simply because they were killed. Historians still argue over how deeply this event affected the Scottish spirit. Some say fear crushed everything, but there's also the theory that the scattered remains became something Edward never anticipated, a shared story whispered from hearth to hearth, through every bitter winter. Do you remember when Wallace's head was placed atop London Bridge? King Edward believed he had put a final end to all resistance. He wanted that image to be a permanent wall between the Scots and their dream of freedom. But history, in its long, ironic way, rarely obeys the most powerful voices. In the months following Wallace's execution, Scotland appeared silent on the surface. Powerful lords bowed, gave their seals, signed papers acknowledging Edward as supreme ruler. If you had lived then, you might have believed it was over. Envoys traveled between Edinburgh and London, and the treaties seemed like final vows. And yet, deep in the most remote villages, people still whispered Wallace's story like a mournful hymn, a small flame lighting the long dark aslet. Children grew up hearing of the man dragged through the streets who never closed his eyes. Wives retold the execution to their husbands, as if to say, there are some things that must not be broken. There's one more little-known detail. Years later, when the war for independence flared again, many Scottish fighters wore small pieces of checkered cloth, called the Wallace tartaneven, if only a thin strip tied around the arm. They believed it was a quiet way of telling the enemy, he is still here. You can imagine Edward on his deathbed, murmuring the names of fortresses, believing he had extinguished all resistance. But in truth, what he did was plant a seed deeper beneath the surface. Someone once wrote, when he killed Wallace, He didn't know he had just created a collective soul. About 7 years later, in 1314, the Battle of Bannockburn erupted, a battle remembered for centuries. Robert the Bruce, once a countryman of Wallace, led a Scottish army, far smaller in number, but willing to die for the fire Wallace had ignited. Historians still debate. Was Robert truly influenced by Wallace's death? Some say it was merely a propaganda tool to unite the people, but there are accounts that on the eve of battle, Robert invoked Wallace before his troops, presenting him as a symbol of unyielding resolve, wherever the truth lies. What's undeniable is that Bannockburn shattered the illusion of absolute English dominion. If you're lying there listening, you might be smiling to yourself, thinking, in the end, who really won? Edward triumphed in law, on paper, through treaties, but Wallace, who left behind no riches, no throne, no castle, won in memory. And memory lasts far longer than any statute. A little-known fact, centuries later, even as Scotland remained under British rule, poets, musicians, and historians still quietly wove Wallace's name into their work, not as a flawless hero, but as an ordinary man who dared to give everything for what he believed was right. Picture yourself as an ordinary citizen of London in 1305. On a summer morning, you leave your thatched home, your son in tow, and squeeze into the crowd gathering around Smithfield. They say today there will be a great execution. And you, like hundreds of others, are drawn more by curiosity than hatred. It's often assumed that the crowd was full of barbarians, cheering as William Wallace was hanged, drowned, and quartered. But the truth is more complicated. In their eyes, this was a ritual, almost a state-sanctioned ceremony, orchestrated with pomp and public messaging for months. They came not just out of cruelty, but because they believed they were witnessing sacred justice. Some came to affirm they were on the right side. Some came out of fear, worried that absence might be seen as sympathy. And of course, there were those genuinely eager for public violence. At the time was an accepted form of entertainment. You might go silent as you realize how easily crowds can be swayed. A scattered group of mild people is harmless, but once given a noble cause, justice, or quelling rebellion, they can become an unconscious machine, endorsing humiliation without thought. Perhaps the most frightening thing wasn't the punishment, but the crowd's calm, indifference, their detachment. Imagine someone selling hot pastries, squeezing past you, cheerfully hawking snacks beneath the gallows. That image, the mingling of food and ethos, the raw essence of feudal society, violence normalized until it becomes part of everyday life. Modern historians still debate. Did public executions really maintain order, or merely sow fear and hatred? Some say they curbed private violence. Others argue those scenes hardened hearts, making it easier for people to applaud as someone was dragged through the mud. And if you take a step back, looking across European history, Wallace's story is but one link in a long chain of spectacles of domination. In France, those deemed heretics were burned alive before thousands. In Spain, the Inquisition hung traitors from city walls. In Italy, squares preserved execution stakes for decades as constant reminders. Why did such practices endure so long? Perhaps because they touch an ancient instinct in humans, the belief that if we witness others punished, we might be spared. But if you look closer, even within those crowds, there were other eyes that knew fear, felt shame, and asked themselves, one day, could it be me? It was those small, silent glances that eventually accumulated into a will for change. So when we speak of Wallace's death, We're not just talking about a man being killed, we're talking about a society learning to reflect. Even if fear gripped people for decades, someone, eventually, dared to step out of line and say, enough. If you're lying there listening, you might wonder, what does this have to do with me? It does. Because the biggest question is not, how did Edward rule? Or, how did Wallace die? The biggest question is, when faced with injustice, do we bow our heads in silence or stand tall? And perhaps that very question is the deepest legacy this story leaves behind. Would you like to keep going? Because there's still much to tell about Wallace's descendants. About the ballads whispered through the centuries. About why, after all this time, his name still makes Scottish hearts stir. If you're ready, I'll keep telling you. When the fragments of his body were hung from city gates and stone bridges, people thought it was the end. A criminal punished, a rebellious tale concluded, but in truth, that was only the beginning of a legendone that crept into every household, every tavern, every folk song. Imagine, hundreds of years ago, each winter in Scotland was cold enough to crack the skin. With snow blanketing rooftops, people would gather around the fire, and it was in those long nights that the story of Wallace was retold, sometimes as a tragedy, sometimes as a promise. A father would whisper to his child, "Remember this, son, no freedom is ever given." Wallace paid for it with his own body. Over time, he became a symbol, no longer a man with rage, mistakes, or rash decisions. He became a name that evoked belief. If one person can stand tall before tyranny, then anyone can. The bards carried that story across the countryside. In oral ballads, Wallace was not just a rebel, but the son of Mother Scotland. Some versions said he was prophesied at birth. Others embellished his feats into myth. You might laugh, call it mere legend. But it was these layers of myth that kept the fire of independence alive. Here's something few people know. For centuries, in some Scottish villages, Wallace was remembered with a quiet day of tribute. No parades. No trumpets, just small gatherings. Sipping malt whiskey. Mentioning his name like that of a fallen brother. Think about it. Edward Longshanks built dozens of fortresses to suppress Wales, imposed heavy taxes to choke Scotland, hanged every flicker of rebellion. But he couldn't destroy the most intangible force of all, collective memory. That memory was so enduring that over 400 years later, Robert Burns, Scotland's greatest poet, still wrote of Wallace with tender reverence. Freedom and Wallace's name remain still linked together. You may lie still, eyes closed, and let those words sink in. There are names which, though declared traitorous, outlive the very thrones that condemned them. The spiritual heir of Wallace was Robert the Bruce, who carried forward the fight for independence. After many battles, in 1328, the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton was signed, England's first formal recognition of Scottish sovereignty. You might see it as the belated conclusion to the war Wallace began, even if he never lived to see it. Still, I don't think it ended there. Even after the treaty, England would return again and again to reclaim Scotland. But in every generation, the story of Wallace was told, and he was a vow. If they forget, we will remember. Some say the entire Wallace mythos is merely inflated patriotism. But ask anyone who has ever lived under oppression, and you'll understand. A story to believe in is worth more than 100 statutes. And then, as the world changed, cinema emerged. The name William Wallace entered a new age. The film, Braveheart, released in 1995, though not entirely accurate, stirred the hearts of millions, awakening age-old questions. What is freedom truly worth? If you knew you would die, would you still hold on to your ideals? Is there something greater than your own existence? You're listening now, perhaps thinking this is all just ancient history, but be honest. Within each of us, there are still moments where we must choose between silence and speaking out, between safety and conscience. Imagine, centuries have passed. The bloodstains have faded from the stones of London Bridge. Wallace's bones have turned to dust in the wind. But his story did not disappear. It simply changed its residence from execution grounds and public squares to the collective memory of a people. From the 15th century on, chroniclers and historians began writing down Wallace's life. The most famous of these was the Wallace, an epic poem in Scots, composed by the poet Blind Harry in the late 1400s. That manuscript blended history with legend, exalting Wallace as the ideal warrior, fearless, uncompromising. Though many of its details are fictional, it accomplished what official histories written by victors never could. It inspired, imagine illiterate Scots of the time, gathering at night to hear a storyteller recite Blind Harry's verses. In the flickering firelight, Wallace's image became sacred, familiar, and holy, like a kinsman who had died, so they could lift their heads high. Here's a rarely mentioned fact, though the Wallace is not historically accurate. It became an inseparable part of Scottish identity. Some say it's because of this poem that Wallace's name never vanished from folk memory. As you lie there listening, you might quietly wonder why we still need stories like this. The answer is simple. In a world of injustice, we don't just need truth, we need meaning. And when a new era began, Wallace's image quietly walked forward with his people. In the 19th century, the Scottish cultural revival took hold. Monuments were built across the land, none more prominent than the Wallace Monument, erected atop Abbey Craig near Stirling. If you ever stand beneath that tower, looking out over the lush green fields, you'll feel what millions of Scots before you have felt, a blend of pride and sorrow. Thinking of a man who chose a horrific death rather than bowing his head. As you climb the 246 steps, you'll come upon a sword over 6 meters long, displayed in the main hall. It's believed to be Wallace's actual blade, though historians debate its authenticity. The sight of that ancient steel silences visitors, because sometimes it doesn't matter whether the sword is real, what matters is what it represents. Ask yourself, how does a man born in obscurity, without title or treasure, become someone a nation still builds monuments to centuries later? Perhaps because Wallace touched on a question deeper than power or politics. Is there any value worth sacrificing everything for? But the story didn't end there. When modern cinema emerged, Wallace's image was handed to a new generation. The film Braveheart, 1995, though filled with inaccuracies, turned him into a global symbol of defiance. You might laugh thinking of Mel Gibson's blue-painted face screaming, "Freedom!" but don't dismiss it too quickly. That single cinematic moment caused millions to ask themselves, what is freedom truly worth? And in Scotland, though people know film is just film, what matters more is that the message remained intact. An ordinary person can do something extraordinary. Over 700 years after Wallace was led to the gallows, tens of thousands still come to Stirling each year to stand beneath the monument. They don't come only for history. They come to remind themselves, even if you're poor, without title or army, you can still leave a mark. Even if your body is torn apart, your will cannot be killed. And sometimes, the fear of the crowd is just smoke hiding the truth. Freedom begins with the smallest voice. If you're lying down, eyes gently shut, take a moment to picture Wallace tied to the execution frame, body torn, but eyes wide open, staring into the crowd. And centuries later, that same gaze still looks into our hearts, quietly asking, what will you do when it's your turn to choose? When you think of Scotland today, a land of sweeping valleys, crumbling castles, and mournful bagpipes, you'll realize that Wallace's legacy isn't just found in books or films. It has blended into how the Scottish people understand themselves. Imagine, after Wallace, Scotland was far from peaceful. The war for independence continued for decades, full of betrayals, compromises, and both triumphs and defeats. Robert the Bruce, once a fellow countryman, eventually rose to the throne and reclaimed autonomy. But what Wallace began wasn't merely a war. It was a new definition of honor and national dignity, centurie later. Even as Scotland was merged into the United Kingdom, even as the Gaelic language nearly vanished, the idea of freedom flowed quietly beneath the old stones of Edinburgh, like an underground spring that never dries. Here's something few notice. In the 18th century, during the Jacobite uprisings, the rebels also drew inspiration from Wallace's spirit. They believed that if a man without a crown once shook an empire, then a resolute people could claim their destiny. You might lie there wondering, what gives such resilience its strange endurance? The answer lies in culture. In every ballad, every poem, every woodcut image of Wallace standing alone against enemy ranks. When rulers changed, when religion, language, and law all shifted, the stories never bent. Picture a winter night, wind howling through the pine, and a father telling his child about Wallace. No printed books, no films, just the crackling fire and memory. It was those memories that built the spiritual bridge between past and present. An interesting note, the 19th century marked a revival of Scottish identity precisely when the British Empire was at its height. In that paradox, Scots longed more than ever to return to their roots. That's why monuments were erected. Schools began teaching local history, and lost legends were carefully collected once again. Did you know that at the Wallace Monument atop Abbey Craig, there's a chamber called the Hall of Heroes? Inside, busts of Scotland's greatest figures are displayed: poet Robert Burns, King Robert the Bruce, scientist James Watt. But at the very center of the room, most prominent of all, stands the statue of Wallace himself, a heavy block of stone, with a stern face and distant gaze. One visitor once wrote in their journal that standing beneath that statue felt like being seen through the eyes of someone who had faced every fear and chose not to step back. An emotion hard to describe, but enough to bring them to tears. If you're lying there listening, I want you to remember this. All power will shift. All walls will eventually fall. But honor, once sown in the human heart, is not so easily lost. The story of Wallace doesn't survive on the past alone. It's renewed every time a generation asks itself, will we remain silent? Will we dare to face tyranny? Do we believe that an ordinary person can alter the course of history? Think about Eighton and age, when everything is easily forgotten. The fact that millions still remember Wallace's name is something of a miracle. And even more miraculous, no one forces them to remember, they do so willingly, holding on to the story as part of their personal dignity. Perhaps that's why, even now that Scotland is more peaceful, even though London no longer displays heads on bridges, Wallace's name remains a quiet reminder. Freedom is never given. It must always be claimed. If you're still listening, your eyes gently closed, you might feel a heaviness not of sadness, but of understanding that every great victory comes at a great cost. Picture a chilly autumn day in Edinburgh. Along the cobbled Royal Mile, tourists fill the old street. Warm pubs spill the scent of baked pastries through open windows. But if you look closely, you'll see many souvenir shops hanging portraits of Wallace beside the Scottish flag, the blue and white saltire of St. Andrew. For many, it's just a keepsake. But for countless Scots, that image is a quiet reminder that freedom is not default. It's a debt paid in blood, in solitude, in the most painful choices. In recent years, Scotland has once again lived through heated debates over independence. The 2014 referendum marked the first time in centuries that Scots were officially asked whether they wished to leave the United Kingdom. Imagine the atmosphere: community meetings, late-night pub arguments, Scottish flags fluttering from balconies, and of course, on flyers, posters, cartoons, Wallace's name appeared again. Many quoted the famous line, though it's unclear if he truly said it: "They may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom." Think about that: a man who died 7 centuries ago, dismembered and displayed before a crowd, now reappearing in the modern national debate. That's the clearest proof of the power of memory. Some say it's just political theatrics, using old images to stir emotion. But if you ask an ordinary Scot, they might tell you something different. They'll say Wallace wasn't about hatred, but about national pride. A pride that's hard to define, but easy to feel when it's wounded. You're listening now, maybe wondering, does that yearning for freedom still belong in the modern world? Yes, it does. Because even if we no longer hang heads from bridges, people still face choices between silence and speech, between safety and truth. Let me share one more detail. When the United Kingdom prepared for Brexit, leaving the European Union, the question of Scottish independence rose again. In hundreds of articles and interviews, Wallace's name surfaced once more, as if he were a figure who would never rest. A reporter once asked an old man in Glasgow, "Why do people still talk about Wallace after all these centuries?" He only smiled, his voice raspy. Because when you've been forced to bow your head long enough, you never forget the day someone stood tall for you. It's the simplest answer, but perhaps also the truest. If you're lying in the dark, take a moment to reflect. Even if you're not Scottish, even if you've never seen the monument atop Stirling's Abbey Craig, you surely understand this. Every community has its own Wallace. Someone who dared to do what no one else would. Someone who accepted a price no one wanted to pay. Maybe it's a human rights activist. Maybe a defiant journalist. Maybe a parent who simply refused to bow to injustice. And years later, when their children grow up, they will remember. They'll remember that someone once proved freedom isn't a privilege, it's a choice. You can exhale slowly now, letting your thoughts settle. Because this story, in the end, isn't just about Scotland, or England, or the 13th century. It's about us. About the final question. If one day everything is stripped away, what will you hold on to? Picture a crisp autumn morning in Stirling. Fog still lingers over the fields. From the base of Abbey Craig, you look up to see the Wallace Monument, a towering block of stone reaching skyward, over 60 meters high. It's not just a tourist site. It's a declaration in stone. A silent Essoshon. We never forgot. Inside the tower is a room called the Hall of Arms. There, ancient weapons, armor, and banners are on display. Visitors from every corner of the world often stop and linger in front of Wallace's sword blade, nearly the length of a man. Its hilt wrapped in dark leather. No one knows for certain if it truly belonged to him. But in the end, that hardly matters. Because for centuries, it's been belief itself that made the sword sacred. Some say they've seen visitors stand motionless before it, eyes remedried, as if realizing in a flash that freedom doesn't come by promise, it comes by sacrifice. Think about it in today's world, where everything is commercialized at dizzying speed. It's rare for a symbol to retain such power, perhaps because people still need something to believe in, to lean on, to measure their own courage by. Let me share one more detail. Every year, dozens of small events across Scotland honor Wallace. Not grand festivals, but quiet gatherings, a group hiking up a hill, a torchlit night, a reenactment of the Battle of Stirling Bridge. You might laugh and call it performance. But if you ever witness old and young standing together in the cold wind, singing ancient ballads, you'll understand. These rituals aren't for show. They're how people hold on to their essence. Historians still argue about Wallace. Some call him a glorified outlaw. Others hail him as the father of Scottish independence. But all debates fall silent when you reach the summit of that monument. There is no political noise, only sharp wind and open sky. Enough to make you ask yourself, what would I do in his place? If you're still listening, your eyes heavy now, I want you to know, no one made Wallace into a symbol. He was just an ordinary man, pushed into impossible choices by an unforgiving world. That's precisely why his story carries more weight than any fairy tale. It reminds us that in the decisive moment, no one is perfectly ready. Everyone is afraid. Everyone is alone. And yet, a choice must still be made. Think of your own life. Maybe you'll never face an empire. But someday, you'll find yourself on your own London Bridge, a place where you must decide whether to stay silent or move forward. And if you need a reminder, remember Wallace. Not because he was always right, but because he refused to kneel when everything was against him. People often mistake the strength of a nation for its fortresses, armies, and treasures. But ask yourself, what's more enduring than a story told by a father to his son, a mother to her grandchildren, repeated over centuries? Thousands of times, when you walk through Scotland, you'll see that legacy everywhere. On the sign of a pub, the Wallace Inn. On a quiet lane called Wallace Street. In children's textbooks. In the story told by a guide whose voice trembles with pride. He wasn't a saint, just a man who dared to do what he believed in. One more interesting note. In many Scottish schools, children learn about Wallace early, but they don't just learn about battles or death, they learn about choice. That sometimes, the choice doesn't lead to glory, but to a painful end. Yet without that choice, nothing would have ever begun. If you're lying there, listening, you might sigh softly, because even in our age of social media, fake news, and endless trivial debates, the story of Wallace remains simple. Unadorned, untouched, just a reminder. Truth and dignity are never comfortable, but they are always necessary. Imagine a Scottish child today, standing before the monument, looking up at the statue of the man with the sword. They won't understand the political context, nor know the details of the Battle of Stirling Bridge. But they'll know who he is, the one their people have chosen never to forget. And that alone is enough to keep a story alive for centuries. If you'd like, I can tell you more about the old ballads passed down by word of mouth like small stones, pieced together into a path of memory. One of the most famous ballads still sung quietly in small community gatherings goes, Wallace White, O valiant knight, a spirit none could tame. They chained his limbs, they broke his bones, but never crushed his name. You might hear its rhythm like a soft drumbeat in the night, a whisper that some names don't need thrones or armies, only belief. And it is thanks to that belief that Scotland still holds its proud defiancy, a small land, steeped in tragedy. that has never agreed to disappear. If your breath is slowing now, perhaps you understand why I've told this story so long. Because in the end, it's not just about Wallace. It's about anyone who's ever been forced to choose between silence and standing up. Picture a rainy night in the Scottish Highlands. 17th century, in a small stone cottage. A bard wrapped in a soaked woolen cloak sits by the fire. Wind howls against the rock walls. A dim oil lamp flickers, and he begins to sing in a rasping voice. Listen, you who still lie awake. I'll tell you of the man who would not bow. When the longest night of this land came, he stood like an oak against the storm. No one wrote down such ballads with precision, but those simple verses were what kept the story alive longest, because they weren't royal decrees, weren't printed in fine books. They lived in memory, in storytelling, in the breath of people who had nothing left but pride. Think about it when people are stripped of power, of property, even life. The last thing they cling to is the story of who they are. Here's something curious. Some versions of the Wallace ballads don't dwell on battles, but describe one small moment, like the instant he looked up at his executioner, or the final glance he gave the silent crowd. These stories aren't meant to glorify. They're mirrors, reflecting our hidden fear that one day, we too may be pushed to a cliff's edge where we must choose. Endure in silence, or rise. You might ask, does any of this still matter in our time? Yes, because even now, the Scots find strength in that memory. Visit any Highland festival, from small towns like Inverness to major events in Edinburgh, and you'll see the blue and white flag fluttering alongside Wallace's image, sword raised high. In traditional concerts, they still play Scots Wha Hae, a song Robert Burns wrote in the late 18th century. It was penned as if Wallace were addressing his men before Stirling Bridge. Scots, Wha ha we Wallace bled. Scots, wham Bruce has afton led. Welcome to your gory bed, or to victory. You can feel it as a Raitea reminder that courage isn't the property of any one century. Let me share a small story before the night grows too late. A few years ago, at the Wallace Monument, a boy of about 8 stood beside the statue. He looked up for a long time, clutching a tiny Scottish flag. His father leaned down and asked, "Do you know who he is?" The boy nodded. "He's the one who wasn't afraid." And that answer was simple, but it held all the reason why, after 7 centuries, people still tell the story of Wallace. Because a people who refuse to forget their roots are not easily subdued. You're still here with me through this long journey. From the cold streets of London in 1305, to the hearth-lit nights in the Highlands, through centuries of change where one name, once nearly buried, rose to become an immortal symbol. And now, as this story nears its end, I ask you to take one quiet moment to reflect. William Wallace wasn't a saint. He wasn't perfect. He was an ordinary man with anger, with mistakes, with moments of hopeless exhaustion. But he chose to hold on to the one thing the mighty empire could never steal, the right to decide what his life would mean. You may never step onto a battlefield. You may never face a gallows. But each of us, sooner or later, will come to a moment where we must choose between two things: to live quietly and safely, or to live true according to what we believe is right, even if it costs everything. And in that moment, you'll understand why this story has been told and retold across 7 centuries. Not to nourish hate, but to remind us that human dignity is never a thing to be bargained. If you close your eyes tonight, you might picture the statue of Wallace atop Abbey Craig, his face turned calmly to the horizon. Not angry, not proud, just the quiet resolve of a man who chose not to bow. And if one day you must step through your own fear, I hope you'll remember him as a reminder that freedom and dignity always come with a price. But it is a price worth paying.